We begin, though, with the breaking news and a dramatic development in the aftermath of George Zimmerman's not guilty verdict. The first African-American U.S. Attorney General, Eric Holder, for the first time today sharing a deeply personal connection to Trayvon Martin's death and questioning stand your ground. That's Florida's controversial self-defense law in the spotlight because of the case. The Attorney General addressed the NAACP convention in Orlando just a few moments ago, an organization of activists that's now amassed 1 million signatures calling for federal charges against George Zimmerman.
These laws try to fix something that was never broken. There has always been a legal defense for using deadly force if, and the if is important, if no safe retreat is available. But we must examine laws that take this further by eliminating the common sense and age-old requirement that people who feel threatened have a duty to retreat outside their home if they can do so safely. By allowing and perhaps encouraging violent situations to escalate in public, such laws undermine public safety. The list of resulting tragedies is long and unfortunately has victimized too many who are innocent. It is our collective obligation. We must stand our ground to ensure that our laws reduce violence and take a hard look at laws that contribute to more violence than they prevent.
All right, let's bring in our chief political analyst, Gloria Borger, also joining us, the former federal prosecutor, Tanya Miller, as well as criminal defense attorney Ann Bremner for some analysis on what we just heard. Tanya, let's go to you first. What do you think of the Attorney General now saying these stand your ground laws, you got to do away with them?
I think that that is a very powerful statement. I think that's probably one of the strongest takeaways from his speech there at the NAACP. You know, it was interesting, Wolf, he also put a very personal face on the issue of racial profiling, which, as we see, when it meets up with these stand your ground laws, can have deadly consequences for young African-American males. I thought that it was very powerful for him to do it. He did not, however, give any indication about whether or not the Justice Department will, in fact, file charges. Not that we would expect him to at this point. Obviously, the investigation continues. But I think what he said will resonate with lots of African Americans. And I think that he is probably feeling a good deal of personal pressure to take some action in this case, whether he ultimately can or not.
And what do you think of his recommendation to do away with these state laws in Florida, for example, stand your ground?
Well, I think that if he was going to announce today more on investigations for civil rights violations, charges investigating further, and/or hate crimes, we would have heard it. So I think there's a lot of an outcry saying, let's get rid of some of these, laws out there that made all of this possible or impossible in terms of the prosecution. I'm not surprised to hear him talk about it. That's a statute in Florida, although many states have stand your ground. I think it was really the problem in this case and the reason the case didn't get charged from the get-go.
And it's very hard, Gloria, as you well know, and you've been doing your own reporting on this, for the Justice Department, the Attorney General, to go ahead and charge George Zimmerman with violating hate crimes or civil rights abuses. The evidence may or may not be there, but I think everything we're hearing, it's probably not enough to go ahead with these formal charges.
You know, he did make the case today that the Justice Department has an open investigation, as he called it, that he's going to look into it. But the bar, as you point out, is very, very high, Wolf. And my sources over there at the Justice Department say to me it's not likely at this point that they would bring some kind of civil rights charges. But what the Attorney General did was take it in a different direction. Take on the stand your ground laws, which, by the way, are laws in 22 states in this country, including the state of Florida, going out of his way to say that it foments violence. And, so it's very clear that along with the Voting Rights Act, which he talked about now, Stand Your Ground, is going to be something else the administration will be talking about. In many ways, Wolf, Eric Holder Up until this point, we may hear more from the president later today, but up until this point, Eric Holder has become the spokesman and the voice of this administration on this case, and now on Stand Your Ground. And we may hear more from the president, as I said, but he's the person who's been out front and center on this.
And he was very personal today in speaking about Trayvon Martin. I'm going to play a little clip from the speech because he could relate. He said he could relate to what the Trayvon Martin family is going through, and he also spoke about his own son. Listen to this.
Trayvon's death last spring caused me to sit down to have a conversation with my own 15-year-old son, like my dad did with me. This was a father-son tradition I hoped would not need to be handed down. But as a father who loves his son and who is more knowing in the ways of the world, I had to do this to protect my boy. I am his father, and it is my responsibility not to burden him with the baggage of eras long gone, but to make him aware of the world that he must still confront.
Powerful words, Tanya. I'm sure you agree.
I do. And I think many African Americans agree with that and understand that uniquely. These are conversations that mothers and fathers have with their sons regularly because, you know, the fact of the matter is when these children go out into the world, there are people who view them as criminal based on just how they look or how they dress. And I think that this is part of why we see many people so divided on the case of Trayvon Martin, because this issue of racial profiling, this sort of subjective viewing of African-American youth as thugs or as criminals, is something that many in America don't deal with, so they can't relate to it, and therefore they don't understand it.
And is there still, from a legal perspective, a double standard in the United States for young African-American boys and young white boys?
Well, that's part of the outcome of this case. I think that people have concluded that it started from the beginning, Wolf. It started first when he was viewed by George Zimmerman, and it didn't change. I think a lot of people see that. And I think everyone has said, or many people have said that are critical of this verdict, that if you switch the races, you know, switch roles in this case, we wouldn't have had this outcome. So I think we need to look, you know, are we either part of the solution or part of the problem, as Eldridge Cleaver once said. But, you know, what do we learn out of this case, and how can we make it different in the future? You can't solve an issue in a trial. The kinds of issues that we have in this case, you can't solve them in a trial. You have to solve them at a national conversation level. And so, you know, I'm encouraged to see, of course, I think we all are, to see a lot of conversation about these issues, very, very frank and ongoing.
You know, Wolf, what was the most affecting to me, not only was Eric Holder talking about his son, but he was also talking, here you have an African-American attorney general talking about his own personal experiences, having been pulled over on the New Jersey Turnpike when he said he wasn't quite sure he was speeding, or having been pulled over on his way to a movie in Georgetown when, as he pointed out, he was a federal prosecutor. And so he talked about how this situation, how being so-called profiled without using the word, how that has affected him. And I think that it's very important to hear that from the Attorney General of the United States, who also happens to be black.
And I suspect we're going to be hearing more from the President of the United States on this sensitive subject as well. Gloria Borger, thanks as usual. Tanya Miller and Bremner, thanks to both of you for coming in as well.